It took this developer 5 years to realize the significance of this particular skill, but hopefully in just a few minutes you can learn why it's so important and make a difference for the future. Hi, my name is Nick Cosentino, and I'm a Principal Software Engineering Manager at Microsoft. In this video, we're going to jump over to Reddit and read through a post where the individual was talking about the importance of written language skills. Now, to be fair, it's not that it took him 5 years to realize the significance of this skill, it's that it took him 5 years to realize that most companies just seem to undervalue the importance of this particular skill. We're going to have a read through of the post, I'm going to give my perspective on why I think written communication is so important, and then we're going to analyze some of the comments. If that sounds interesting, just a reminder to subscribe to the channel and check out that pinned comment for my courses on Dome Train. With that said, let's jump over to Reddit and read through this post. Okay, so this post is titled, "After 5 years of working in tech, I've surmised that almost every company severely underestimates the importance of English writing skills. Some of the tickets I see are so badly written and communicated that it's left me thinking that, as an industry, we underestimate how important it is for staff to be able to write clearly and succinctly. The amount of time we waste seeking clarification when it comes to tickets must be huge. It makes sense when you think about it. We put people through all sorts of assessments during the interview, competency interviews, coding assessments, take-home challenges, and yet we don't seem to care whether a new hire can write well. What makes it even worse is that this skill has become even more important with the rise of working from home and with many of us communicating over Slack, Teams, etc." I think this is a very interesting take, right? If you watch my other content, I talk all the time about why I think communication in general is extremely important. A lot of the time I'll have people reaching out to me, aspiring software engineers, juniors, they're asking what they should be focused on. And it's always questions about technology, like what's the best language, what's the best tech stack, which projects should I be building, how do I demonstrate on my resume that I have all these technical skills? And while that is important to be able to have the technical skills, it almost feels like people forget just how important some of these soft skills or people skills are. So in particular, in this video, we're going to be talking about a written language. So yes, I think communication in general is critical. So even when we're talking about you're having meetings with people or you're having conversations in general, your spoken communication, being able to say things clearly, get to the point on topics, make sure that you're thinking about your target audience as you're communicating so that people understand what you're trying to convey. That's all important, but it really, really applies to written language as well. And if you think about it as software developers, what are we writing all of the time? Right? It's code. We write tons of code. And if our code, you hear this a lot, right? Our code needs to be clear. It needs to be readable. We spend so much more time reading code than writing code. And that means that if we're not writing clearly, even in our code, it's going to be very difficult to even, understand your own code in the future. But we're working in teams. You need to be able to convey ideas and meaning through your code to other people on the team. It could be next week, it could be a month from now, it could be years from now. But people need to be able to understand your code. But it's not just code, right? I think that's the obvious one. We always are coding, so it's a really obvious one when it comes to written communication. But what about pull requests and code reviews, right? The comments that we're leaving for individuals. We're going to see as we go through some of the comments in here, there's going to be talk about work items or tickets that you might have in Jira, Azure DevOps, Trello, whatever else you're using. The idea there is like when people are like, creating a ticket or something, it's like, fix the bug. And it's like, well, where's the information on this, right? How is this valuable? And it makes it really difficult for other people or even yourself to pick up on this work later. In general, I agree with this person, we end up wasting so much time when we're not clearly communicating. And I think there's a lot of examples in terms of written communication that we could do such a better job. And honestly, it does not take that much more effort. I think we just have to have a little bit more awareness of the fact that we are communicating and we need to be clear when we're doing it. So the couple of examples that come to mind before we start scrolling through some of these comments and reading through them, I've already talked about code. I think when you're doing code reviews and pull requests, the comments that you're leaving for other people, you want to make sure that you're not just saying like, bad code, fix this, like we don't do this, this doesn't work. Like try to explain why, right? Add the context into there. Make it easier for the other person to understand. I think that's incredibly important. I think one, like I said, that comes up in here is going to be work items. So if you need to be able to document something like we do need to add this feature, we do need to fix this bug, tech debt in particular for software engineers, a lot of the times what will happen is if you're trying to propose that tech debt is getting prioritized and scheduled in terms of the other work that's being done, you need to make sure that people understand what that tech debt is. If you just say, like, clean up this class or clean up this part of the code, like, why? What's so bad about it? What does clean up mean? What impact is that having? Like, documenting this information is incredibly important because we've all seen it, right? Especially with tech debt. You bring it up, someone says, yep, that makes sense, but it's not a priority right now. Maybe it's never a priority. But if it is going to get brought up later, you want to make sure that if it is a priority, it can get the attention. But what's going to happen if someone opens this ticket and says, what was the priority on this again? Is it time to schedule it? And it doesn't make any sense. Not going to be a good time. It's probably just getting kicked back into the backlog or even deleted or closed off. So making sure that you are clear in these is going to go a long way. And I realize that for some people that just feels like extra work, but truly, what's more work? Spending a little bit more time trying to write this stuff clearly, or having more conversations going back and forth, potentially multiple times, and spending even more time than just spending a little bit more time up front writing clearly. Commit messages are another one. I think there's a lot of guidelines online for following like templated or consistent styles for your commit messages. This might not seem as important to some people if you're not actively going through and looking at history. Depending on how you're working, your team structures like this might seem less valuable, but I've been in situations where we need to see what's been changed, looking through a code change and kind of looking through what the commit messages are and seeing what someone was trying to do versus what code was actually changed can be very helpful in making sure that we understand, especially if we have to revert something out. I would highly recommend putting a little bit of extra effort into that. I say that knowing that in my own personal projects, a lot of my commits are like curse words that I finally fixed something or something like that. So I get it, but I think if I were working in teams and in larger organizations committing code, I would want to make sure that I'm being pretty clear about what's happening. Next, we can think about messages that we're sending. So like I think in this original post here, Slack, Teams, whatever you're using for communicating with your colleagues, you got to remember, right? They're not all going to be software engineers. They're not all going to be working in the exact same space as you, even if they are software engineers. So you need to think about what you're trying to say to your target audience. So writing messages, asking for help on something, for example, you can save a lot of time by being more clear about the scenario that's going on so that you don't have this back and forth trying to get someone to prod you for information on things. In fact, you might even find that in those scenarios, you add enough context and someone says, look, we should probably just get on a call for this because it's going to be a little bit more involved. Written communication and messages, things like email as well. You want to make sure that you're providing enough context and explaining things again for your target audience. I don't think I can say this enough because I still see it all the time from all different levels of software engineers, even other roles as well, where you want to think about who your target audience is. If you start explaining things in a way that probably only you or someone very technical in your domain is going to understand, like what are the odds that you should be expecting that other people can, meet you at that level? Is everyone that technical? Does everyone understand that domain that effectively? If they do, then that's a great way to communicate, right? You're meeting people at their expected level of understanding. But if you're talking to a different team that doesn't understand these things, or perhaps different roles that maybe don't have as much technical background in your domain, you're going to want to find other ways that they can understand this stuff. So there's a lot of different ways that we can focus on having a better, clearer communication, but you need to actively be thinking about these things so that you can practice doing a better job. So let's go read through some of the comments and see what some other people had to say. So right at the top here, as someone who writes 90% of our internal documentation, I agree 100%, right? So this person's realizing it too. I think, so I took a bunch of online technical writing classes and I would highly recommend them. So interesting, right? If this is something where you're like, maybe I am struggling with this, maybe I don't have enough, I feel like I have enough opportunity to practice it, you could go look for a class or something like that to go practice this kind of thing. And that way you can get some different perspective on different ways to go writing things. I've personally never taken a technical writing class or anything like that, but I feel like in my experience, at least, I've had to deal with many different types of stakeholders. So might not be something that I would value as much, but certainly if this is something that you are having challenges with, that might be a great opportunity. There's a link here for the Google one that's like tech writing. So developers.google.com/tech writing overview. I haven't checked this out, but the link looks pretty fresh. Lots and lots of upvotes on that, so might be something to go consider. This person goes on to say, I agree, but I'll add that part of the problem is that getting good requirements is a bunch of work in and of itself. So often people find it easier to be vague or to use obfuscating language and make the developer do all that. It's somewhat reinforced by the fact that often you'll have senior plus level devs who will write their own tickets for certain things like tech debt, and since they understand the issue, the ticket describes almost nothing, just a vague reference. So the vague or half-done tickets become normalized. Yeah, so this is kind of what I was hinting at near the beginning, right? So if you're going to be writing tickets, especially for things like tech debt, if you're writing it only for you to be able to reference, like that might not even be good enough for you a month from now. You might lose all of that context because you're off doing other things. So writing tickets, you want to think about other people understanding this information, and at a minimum, that's you in months from now. If you months from now aren't even going to understand it, how can you imagine that other people are going to as well, right? So think about the individuals that you're working with, so your colleagues who might be trying to prioritize this kind of stuff, other teammates, and make sure that you're trying to write for them as well. If you think that they're not going to understand it, probably want to go put some more effort into that. This person goes on to say it's a pet peeve of theirs, especially since older tickets inevitably get canceled because even the writer forgot what they were tangentially insinuating, right? So it's just like there's a brief amount of text and it's like, yeah, people aren't even going to remember that months from now. Let's keep going here, move on from some of the ticket stuff. We'll scroll a little lower. Providing a link to the class, we already kind of mentioned that. So people are saying, okay, this one's interesting. So the problem Reddit doesn't want to say or admit to is that the cost of a large majority of the workforce being on visa or offshored. So shocking, if you hire people not born in a country that natively speaks English, the documentation and communication barriers might happen. So this is interesting, right? Like if you have global companies that are bringing people on from different areas of the world, this is an interesting take, right? Certainly I've worked with individuals where they're even worried about their own communication. So never mind, like I know if you're hearing this or reading what this person said and you want to jump on and say like, hey, like that's not fair of them to say, I have worked with multiple engineers that are concerned about how they communicate, right? Never mind someone else coming to them and saying you're not communicating clearly. These individuals are worried about it, whether that is their spoken language or their written language. So I have seen this in my own experience come up from individuals from different countries. So I think that this is a real thing. Now, that doesn't mean that these people cannot get better at writing. I think everyone can, right? They can get better at communication, but I think it's an interesting point here that if we're bringing people on from different countries, if we go back to the idea that what the OP was saying, if it's not something we're interviewing for, right? If that's not a focus, like, should we be surprised? I think the answer is no, we shouldn't be surprised. But that also means that maybe it's not a matter of like, okay, we gatekeep people because their written language isn't good enough. It might be something where we acknowledge it and we say, look, we acknowledge this. That means we're going to have to spend extra time helping these people skill up in this because it is important. And the same thing applies, in my opinion, to programming languages, because I've seen this work really well. People, it's not like these individuals maybe in their own language, their native language, maybe they're great at being able to articulate all this information very clearly. So it's not the technical writing that's a problem for them. Maybe it's just that English is a challenge for them. But the same thing with the programming language. I've had people brought onto my teams at Microsoft. The overwhelming majority of people that have been hired onto the teams that I've worked with at Microsoft, sort of like after or right before I started, I think I might be wrong statistically on this. One, for sure, maybe two people that have been brought onto my teams have known C# before. So that means every other person has come on and not actively worked in C#. Like they might know what it is, but they haven't programmed in it. So we spend time and they learn C#, right? It's going to be challenging in the beginning, but we spend time to make sure that's better. So could be the same type of thing for written language. I, of course, do not have stats on this, so I can't say that this is fact or not, but I think that it's interesting. Something else I want to say is also some of it is cultural differences as well. What is expected to be communicated in one culture could be seen as unnecessary in another culture. This is the cost of all this. This is an interesting take too. I've actually had employees from Mexico, especially from verbal communication. They have told me that they have this awareness. At least these individuals that were talking to me about it, this awareness that how we communicate in different cultures. They have said that there's some cultures that they've interacted with. Go out of their way to try and soften things before delivering some type of key message, right? So they'll do a bit more of a preamble to try and like feel things out, kind of make sure that everything's okay in the conversation, and then get into delivering their message. And they've acknowledged again that they've been working with other cultures where that's completely not the case, where it's much more direct, much more succinct, and there's situations, and they were telling me about these, where it's almost awkward because they're doing a lot more softening, and they talk to someone who's like, why the heck are you, like, they can tell, they're like, why are you doing this? And then they get this really direct response, and they're like, okay, okay. So I think this is a really interesting point on the cultural differences. In my opinion, it's not a right or wrong thing. I think it's about awareness of it. So if we have awareness that there are different cultures involved, people have different ways that they expect to communicate. This is all really important. We have to think about our audience when we're having verbal communication or written communication. So I think that's an interesting take for sure. This person says at least 80% of programmers I've worked with don't even try to shape their code into any sort of consistent narrative. I wouldn't expect anything different from their emails or their documentation. As long as incoherent programs can still make money, we're going to have to live with this. Interesting. I feel like I kind of agree with this because it's like, if it works, people are going to keep going, right? But I'm not saying that I agree with that we should just be okay with it. I think that they're probably right with this, but I do think that, and I don't think this person's not saying this, but I think that we should put more emphasis on trying to make this better, right? It is an efficiency thing if we can have more clear communication. This person says, this is something I'm feeling more and more. The code should be functional, but it's also a communication with the next developer who has to read it. So I said this earlier when I was giving my perspective on this stuff, right? So you need to think about the intended audience, thank you, and how they're going to perceive, understand the code. And we said the same thing about writing work items and stuff like that, right? You need to think about your audience. When you're writing stuff down or you're saying things, if you're just thinking like, this makes sense to me only, are you talking to yourself? Because if you're not talking to yourself, you probably need to be adjusting how you communicate with your target audience. If you know, because you've worked with your target audience a lot, that they are very much like you and they seem to happen to understand all the same things very well, you might be able to get away with it, but think about your target audience. Even something as simple as please put the test cases inputs for your test next to the actual test method is something I can't believe I have to tell people over and over. It'll run the same, but if you just dump everything into a file willy-nilly, it's a nightmare to read. So interesting, right? So they're talking about some coding standards, different ways. It might be a stylistic type of thing, but they're saying like, hey, look, like if you co-locate things, it makes it easier to understand. So that could be a personal preference. There might be reasons that people want to do it a different way. But the point is like, if people aren't thinking about how this stuff gets interpreted, it's a missed opportunity for doing it more effectively. And finally, we're going to jump down to this one. This person says, this is why I'm glad to have a history degree. Interesting. Early in my career, it dawned on me that the first functional version of a deliverable, be it a utility script that's just for now until we can write a much better version, or adding a feature to a product, it's just a first draft. It also helped me to not take critical code review comments personally. I've talked about this before, right, where we want to be able to separate ourselves from the feedback, but I think there's also an opportunity for the reviewer to just not be a butthole when they're leaving feedback. Like, you can also do a little bit more work leaving comments. You can make things explained well. You can make sure that you're trying to write things in a way that don't feel like they're an attack. Like, I think communication works both ways, but yes, to this person's point, having some of that background is giving them that ability to not take it personally, which I think is awesome. So meaning a judgment on my value, not an attack on me, right? So great point. It's possible to take that mindset too far, which is where communication about expectations is vital. But I find the refinement process, including proper documentation, is a lot less frustrating when it's treated like any other writing process. So a reason I wanted to read this comment out too is because they said, this is why I'm glad to have a history degree. I do try to, on my channel and other social media platforms, talk about the fact that people with different backgrounds, so not just going sort of the air quotes traditional software engineering route of like, I was born with a keyboard in hand, I've been programming in 17 languages for the last 40 years, like, and then went to university, like people that did not do that and they happen to take maybe an alternative path, there are plenty of awesome skills and experiences that can really contribute into software development. It's different perspectives, it's different experiences. In this person's case, I think it's a great point that they're saying their history degree actually helped them with this part in particular. With all of that said, I hope you have some additional perspective on why written communication is so valuable in software development. And that means that as you go forward, hopefully you can help shape the areas and the companies that you're working in to try and make communication, whether it's spoken or written, improved, right? We want to make this better for the future going forward. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.